Hello, my name is James Pikeway. Welcome to Podaholics, the podcast, and a podcast replay. What is a podcast replay and what is this podcast replay? Well, quite simply, we go back into previous podcasts and we pull out excerpts, pieces that we found really interesting. And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to get a re-listen to a few really focused segments of a podcast? We're talking homeopathy in this podcast, and what I was really interested in getting into with Dr. Jenna and Dr. Ryan was, well, what exactly is homeopathy and why would anyone choose it as a career anyway? So, Ryan Penny gave us the thumbnail sketch of how homeopathy came about and why a budding football star, soccer star, would make the shift to homeopathy and what caught his fancy and where is he now? That's what you're going to be listening to right here on this podcast replay. Homeopathy. What is it and why do we care? Here we go.
I think as well, some people like to link homeopathy with going to China on holiday and going to a Chinese pharmacy and seeing some really crazy things in jars. And obviously that's totally different because that's Chinese medicine and this is homeopathy, which are very different. But again, I'm not qualified enough to talk about it, so...
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, I listened to those two stories and you're right. I think there are so many misconceptions. I think homeopathy at one stage was pretty much linked with Eastern medicine, Eastern philosophy, those kinds of things, which it's not, actually. If you're going to peg it back, not that my history on the homeopathy is what it was when I was still studying, but it's sort of rooted in probably mid-1700s Germany, by a medical doctor at the time who was disillusioned with what was happening. I think that they were probably killing more patients than what they were helping. And he actually moved away, Hahnemann was his name, he moved away from the actual practice of medicine into translation.
Okay.
So he was a linguist and he started translating some of the documents and he picked up that there was this interesting sort of observation that certain things seem to cause symptoms and then in a sort of the same substance could go ahead and treat similar symptoms. And what he was looking at then was cinchona bark. So that's where we get salicylic acid or aspirin.
Yeah.
So he made this observation, realized that if I give this substance, I seem to cause symptoms. And when somebody has those symptoms and I give this substance, it seems to cure it. So that was what he based homeopathy on, which, you know, was on those observations, and he coined the phrase like cures like. So at its root, that's the idea. The idea of homeopathy, which is a component of complementary alternative medicine, is if I find something that causes symptoms, is there the possibility/probability that I could treat those kinds of symptoms with that same substance, but then through a series of dilutions. And the reason being, he was saying if I give it in its raw, natural form, sometimes it is too strong for the system to handle. So as we would do with most things, is you sort of tone it down a little. And he went through a series, yes, there were some philosophical components to it, through a series of dilutions, and that he termed potentizing. So that's why you have homeopathics that are seemingly nothing in them. And that's the argument that you have from many people is they would say, well, it's basically just water or the lactose pill or whatever the carrier is. And it's true to recognize that when you have diluted something to a point beyond Avogadro's number, right, technically there's nothing left in the substance. And yet there are homeopaths who will say, well, we'll keep diluting because it seems to be still effective and sometimes even more so. Now, that's where I sort of draw the line. Sean and I would practice what we call clinical homeopathy, which is we'd look at things from a medical perspective and say that there are certainly substances that are not diluted to that particular point. But when you start looking at, the levels of certain hormones or biochemicals within the systems, they are in minute quantities. So then the idea of giving something in a minute quantity, whether it be for an allergy, for your wife, or those kinds of things, it almost makes sense to think, well, maybe I can stimulate the body's natural defense mechanism because in essence, that's what your body's trying to do. we talk about infections, we talk about all these kinds of things. Your body is trying desperately to survive for as long as possible. This is what it's doing. So the homeopathic idea is, can I find something that's going to come alongside and support that process rather than block certain things or kill certain things or replace things, which is very, very much the medical sort of mindset. So my training, my background, well, before I did homeopathy, I had no intention of doing anything. I was a footballer. So,
and this is back in South Africa?
This is back in South Africa. So this is, sort of rewind 1990, 1991. And all I wanted to do was get to the UK and play soccer.
Okay.
So I ended up having to go via, because of the South African political situation. I had a scholarship to go and study in the States, play football in the States, in Florida. And the idea was, if I could get there 4 years, I get one extra year, then I can maybe head to the UK and we'll see what happens from there. Well, there was a scout out who was supposed to be organizing things in that year, 91, 92, I think. And I ended up dislocating my elbow in a match.
Oh, no.
And that was pretty much the end of my football.
How on earth in a football match do you dislocate your elbow?
I was a goalkeeper.
Right, okay.
Yes. So I grabbed the ball, somebody kicked me out, I landed like that, and that was the end of my elbow. And the coach was there, the scout was there, and he was like, oh, okay, you have half a scholarship now. And my family couldn't afford at that point to go to the States. So I thought, okay, well, what am I going to do? Now I'm thinking I can't play anymore, so maybe physio is a good idea, right? So I'm thinking along those lines, and I had not been paying too much attention to academics. I was just playing sport all the time. Then basically, I had one more year of school, and I listened to a talk that somebody gave on homeopathy, and I was like, that sounds really interesting to me. And I went and spoke to him afterwards, and I said to him, would you mind if I come and visit your practice? And he said, by all means. And probably the best thing that could have happened was this particular guy was very, very much medical. So homeopathy had that sort of dingy room, involved with a couple of other things, and you go to the little drawers and you
I think you have to wear a cardigan as well.
the cardigan.
It's like being vegetarian years ago. You had to wear a cardigan.
There's a type, right?
It's the preconceptions, isn't it?
Exactly. And then you go back to the little room and you don't know what they're doing there, but you take something and maybe you
There's
get
not much lighting.
And I went to this guy, and he had like a fully stocked pharmacy, and it was clean and it was clinical, and his rooms were smart, and I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. This is actually really nice. I like the idea of patients walk in, patients walk out. I wasn't keen on the clinical sort of emergency medicine scene, although I love it. And my brother-in-law is a emergency or casualty specialist who, when I'm with him, I love spending time. But it was like, hey, I'd like to talk to the person. We with each other, and you leave, great. So it so happened that there was a training course that was starting the next year. For the first time, there was a degreed course that was 5 years. And because it was just beginning, it was tied in very, very strongly with what was at that particular point one of the best medical schools in South Africa, Wits Medical School.
Oh, nice.
So our first 2 years were pretty much parallel with the dental and medical students. So we did pretty much everything that you would expect to have to do. So from anatomy and physiology and epidemiology and all the kinds of things that you'd have to be engaged in. In our second year, we were still part of the group that did full dissection at Wits Dental School at that particular point. So again, we had all this influence from these medical professionals who were like, what are these guys doing here? They don't belong, but they're still offloading all this great information. So what ended up happening then into third year, fourth year, fifth year, we had the majority of our lecturers were medically trained, teaching us, pathology and going through diagnostics and everything. So our training was very, very much from a clinical medical side. And at the same time, I used to spend as much time as I could in the hospital because we were technically sort of allowed to observe. They were very gracious to us. They allowed us to come, and then they would give you a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I also used to spend time with my personal GP from when I was, just a kid. And he allowed me to come and spend a lot of time. And he was a real cowboy. So what he used to do in the office...
Is this up in Pretoria,
Johannesburg?
Johannesburg?
This is in Pretoria.
Okay.
Pretoria, Joburg area. Okay. So I studied in Johannesburg and lived in Pretoria. So the commute was also an interesting thing. But, so that was my training. And so I would sometimes sit at the back. I had some major problems with clinical or classical homeopathy, the typical homeopathy that we described. I'm like, there's certain parts of that just don't make sense to me. I don't buy the philosophy on certain of the things. But I see the reason it's there is because you've got guys in the 1800s who are looking at things, they are getting results with their patients. They don't know how to explain them. So what do they start doing? They start coming up with explanations to try and give some sort of insight into what's happening. So what happened was homeopathy didn't develop enough from that side. It kept the philosophies. It kept the things that in many respects the medical profession will shoot down, and rightly so. The problem is in so doing, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. So then sort of what I was sitting by about fourth year, I'm sitting in the back of this lecture room and I'm reading Update, and Modern Medicine, and I'm like, this makes much more sense to me. But I also realize that there are so many patients who are getting treatments that are almost violating the first law of medicine, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier. Well, if this is safe and it's not going to do no harm, and it's not going to do any harm, and we don't have really anything else here, well, why don't you give it a try? In many respects, it was that sort of, well, if there's a problem here that could probably be improved by a lifestyle, of which the 5 most prescribed drugs, you could go ahead and put them aside and get lifestyle change.
We've had these conversations quite a few times.
I can hear this here, and we want to come back to that. We got to complete that circle as well.
So you look at that, and then I'm looking at it and saying, almost from the same perspective, but from the other side, saying, well, if I can change how a person thinks, eats, moves, supplements, and maybe something that's therapeutic from a complementary side that doesn't carry with it significant side effects, and I can go ahead and get an improvement and have this person take ownership of their health, then that's good medicine. So looking and seeing, okay, I identify where I draw the line in terms of what I shouldn't do, in terms of what I can't do, and that's where people like Jenna, you can step in and say, well, I will handle it this way. And that's where collaboration works. But that almost brings us back to where we were before. And that's going to come down to individuals. Unfortunately, much more on a person-to-person basis, medical practitioner with a homeopath who are able to look at things and say, wow, that's interesting. And wow, that's outside of what I should do. And now it's not a competition.
No, that's
the key thing,
isn't it?
Exactly. So one of the places I saw this first and foremost was when I went as a part of my 5th year. I used to spend some time in theater, in operating room. And I noticed that the guys who had the least issue with anything were the orthopedic surgeons, because they were like, you can't do anything I can do. There was no threat. So
they're an interesting
bunch. So as soon as there's no threat, the whole dynamic changes.
You sit around, you're between patients, you're drinking tea, you're eating apples, you're watching TV, you're reading the paper, and it's like, oh, come, we're up again. And there was absolutely nothing. There was no issue. But the anesthesiologist, interestingly, rather keep to himself, have less of a discussion. He's more on the medical side of things, start getting to the cardiologist. Well, now we're almost like we're sort of stepping in a similar area. And I say that with the greatest respect to the professions. But it's a matter of, I don't actually want to cross that bridge. And I'm not sure there's a bridge there to be crossed. So we'll just stick with what we do, and we'll tolerate you for now and don't kill anybody on your way.